The whole town laughed at him and said he was digging his own grave. A broke old veteran moved to a frozen corner of Minnesota, hoping only for quiet and survival. While everyone built upward, he dug deep into the earth, sleeping underground, with only his loyal German shepherd by his side. They called him crazy. Then the blizzard came, and when the snow cleared, the town realized the truth. The man they mocked had slept warm, while winter took everything from them. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter settled over Duluth like a held breath, cold and deliberate, with wind slicing in from Lake Superior and turning every exposed surface into something brittle and unforgiving. Frank Walker had learned long ago not to argue with winter. At 67, his body carried the geometry of a man shaped by endurance rather than comfort. Broad shoulders that had slowly rounded forward, a spine stiffened by years of marching with weight, hands thick at the knuckles and permanently rough, as if the cold itself had etched lines into his skin. His face was angular, and weather-cut cheekbones sharp beneath leathery skin, browned by decades of sun and wind. A trimmed gray beard framed his mouth not for style but practicality, and his eyes, pale, watchful, almost colorless, held the distant steadiness of someone who had learned to expect loss before it arrived. He lived alone on the outskirts of Duluth, where the city thinned into pine scrub and frozen dirt roads, in a modest aging cabin that leaned slightly with the years. Every morning before the sun fully lifted itself above the lake haze, Frank stepped outside wearing the same garment he wore nearly every day, a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, heavy enough to stop wind, worn enough to remember him. The jacket had been with him since his final year of service, its cuffs frayed, the collar softened by time. He trusted it more than he trusted most people. At his side walked Max. Max was a German shepherd well past his prime, somewhere around 10 years old, his once jet-black coat now threaded with silver along the muzzle and shoulders. His frame remained powerful, though slower, his hips stiff in the cold, his amber eyes still sharp with awareness. One ear stood perfectly upright. The other bore a permanent fold, a souvenir from a long-ago scuffle with a raccoon. Max moved with deliberate loyalty, staying close enough that Frank could feel his presence without looking. The dog did not bark unnecessarily, did not waste energy. He watched. He listened. He understood things Frank never said aloud. People in Duluth noticed Frank Walker, though few truly knew him. At the small supply store off West Superior Street, the clerk, a young man named Tyler with perpetually red hands, knew Frank as quiet but unfailingly polite, the sort of customer who counted change carefully and never lingered. Neighbors farther down the road knew him as the old vet, a man who nodded but rarely spoke, who shoveled his own drive even when snow piled higher than the hood of his truck. They also knew him as the man who had started digging a hole in the ground just as winter approached. The hole appeared in early November. While others were sealing windows, stacking firewood, and reinforcing roofs, Frank Walker took a shovel and began cutting into the frozen earth beneath his cabin floor. Each day he worked in silence, lifting soil bucket by bucket, his breath fogging the air, Max lying nearby with his chin on his paws. Neighbors slowed their trucks to stare. A few stopped to comment. "You know winter's coming, right?" one man called out, half joking. Frank merely nodded and kept digging. To them it looked like stubborn madness. To Frank, it was preparation. His silence with others was not born of bitterness, but of experience. During his years in uniform, he had learned that explanations were often wasted on people who had never needed to listen. He had also learned that survival depended less on bravery than on understanding limits of the body of materials, of nature itself. War had taught him how quickly confidence collapsed when systems failed. It had also taught him how cold could kill quietly, without drama, without mercy. But it was not war that haunted his sleep. It was the winter 10 years earlier, when an ice storm knocked out power across the county for nearly a week. Frank's wife Ellen, a woman with soft brown hair and gentle hands that always smelled faintly of soap and pine, had insisted they would be fine. The fireplace was strong. They had blankets. They had each other. On the third night, the temperature inside the cabin dropped below freezing. Ellen developed a cough, then a fever. By the time emergency crews reached them, the storm had already taken its toll. Pneumonia finished what the cold began. Frank never spoke of that winter to anyone. He carried it instead deep and heavy like a second spine inside his chest. So when he dug with purpose. The hole grew deeper each day, eventually reaching below the frost line, where the soil no longer resisted him with iron hardness, but yielded with damp, heavy patience. Frank lined the walls with rounded river stones hauled painstakingly from a creek, nearly 2 miles away, each stone selected for density, for smoothness, for its ability to hold and release heat. His movements were slow but precise, his calculations careful. This was not improvisation. This was memory discipline and quiet resolve. Max occasionally rose to circle the hole, sniffing the air, his tail low but calm. He trusted Frank completely. That trust had been earned through years of consistency, regular meals, steady commands, and a bond forged not through affection alone but through shared isolation. By late November, the whispers began. At the mailbox cluster near the road, people talked. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. One woman, Sarah Collins, watched Frank with something closer to concern than mockery. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with wind-reddened skin and ash-blonde hair usually pulled into a practical braid. She worked at the local clinic and had seen enough frostbite cases to know that winter in Duluth was not something to challenge lightly. Once she asked Frank if he needed help. "I'm fine," he said gently, meeting her eyes for a moment longer than necessary. She nodded and did not press. Inside the growing underground chamber, Frank laid timber beams, fitted insulation, and installed a small iron stove modified to burn efficiently at low output. He thought constantly about airflow, moisture, temperature, gradients. He thought about Max's aging joints, about keeping water from freezing, about what it meant to sleep without fear of waking to silence. That meant something had gone terribly wrong. Above ground, the cabin looked unchanged. Beneath it, something else was taking shape. A quiet answer to a question Winter had once asked him and would surely ask again. Frank did not feel pride as he worked. He felt relief. Each shovel of earth removed eased a pressure inside him, as if he were finally building something that acknowledged reality rather than denying it. When the wind howled at night and snow rattled against the walls, he sat by the fire with Max at his feet, listening not with dread but with readiness. Winter was coming. This time he intended to be waiting. By early December, the hole beneath Frank Walker's cabin had become the most discussed subject on that stretch of frozen road, eclipsing even the weather forecasts that everyone pretended not to fear. Snow fell almost daily now, light, but relentless, and the wind off Lake Superior carried a sharpness that found every weakness in wood and bone alike. Frank worked anyway. He moved with the same steady rhythm each morning, stepping out in his red and black buffalo plaid flannel breath, measured shoulders, slightly hunched against the cold, Max pacing beside him with quiet vigilance. The excavation had passed the point of curiosity and entered the realm of judgment. They said the old man was digging his own grave. Frank heard the words more than once. He never reacted. His face, already carved into something reserved and angular by age and experience, revealed little. The lines around his mouth stayed fixed, the pale eyes unreadable. If the comments bothered him, he stored them somewhere deep, the way he stored everything else that didn't require immediate action. War had taught him that emotions, when indulged too freely, could become liabilities. The underground space was taking shape now. The walls were no longer raw earth, but carefully stacked river stone, rounded and dense, fitted together with patient precision. Frank's hands, thick-fingered and scarred, moved confidently as he placed each stone. Those hands had once assembled weapons in darkness, had learned the feel of metal by memory alone. Compared to that, stonework felt almost meditative. Each placement was a decision, each decision a refusal to leave survival to chance. Max remained a constant presence. The German shepherd's coat had grown heavier with winter, the fur around his neck forming a silvered ruff that gave him a slightly regal look despite his age. He often lay at the edge of the excavation head, resting on crossed paws, ears alert. When strangers came too close, he did not bark aggressively. Instead, he rose slowly, positioning himself between Frank and whoever approached, his amber eyes fixed, assessing. It was not hostility, it was guardianship. One afternoon, as Frank hauled another load of stone from the creek, a pickup truck stopped nearby. The door opened, and a man climbed out, with exaggerated effort, stamping his boots against the snow. His name was Bill Anderson, though Frank knew him only in passing. Bill was in his mid-50s, thick through the middle, with a red face permanently flushed by cold and alcohol. His beard was uneven and patchy, his eyes small but sharp, with the confidence of someone who believed the world ought to make sense according to rules he already understood. "You know," Bill said, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, "there are easier ways to stay warm than crawling into the dirt like an animal." Frank paused, straightened slowly, and met the man's gaze. Up close, the difference between them was clear. Bill's posture carried tension, impatience. Frank's carried weight, memory, discipline, and something quieter. "I'm not trying to be warm," Frank replied evenly. "I'm trying to stay alive." Bill laughed, a short bark of sound that evaporated into the wind. "You vets," he said, shaking his head, "always planning for a war that already ended." Frank did not answer. He returned to his work. Bill watched for another moment, then climbed back into his truck and drove off, leaving behind tire tracks that filled with snow within minutes. Frank understood men like Bill. He had served beside them. They were brave in familiar conditions, confident in known structures. But winter did not care about confidence. Winter rewarded preparation. That night, as Frank worked inside the underground chamber, installing wooden supports and testing airflow through the narrow ventilation pipe, his thoughts drifted unbidden to the past. Not the battlefield those memories stayed sealed, but to the months after Ellen's death, to the quiet that followed, to the way the house had felt too large, too hollow. He remembered sitting in the dark when the power failed again the following winter, listening to the wind press against the walls, wondering if the cold would take him too simply because he had no reason left to resist it. That was when he had found Max. The dog had been at a shelter outside Duluth, thin and wary, labeled older, difficult placement. Frank remembered kneeling in the kennel, meeting those amber eyes through the wire, recognizing something familiar in the dog's stillness. They had both learned not to expect much from the world. They had both survived things that left marks invisible to others. The next morning, Sarah Collins returned. She approached more carefully this time, boots crunching softly over the snow-gloved hands clasped in front of her. Up close, she looked as she always did, tall and spare her movements. Economical, her ash-blonde hair tucked beneath a knit cap. Her skin, pale but weathered, bore the faint lines of someone who spent long hours under harsh lighting and harsher winters. Her eyes were gray, observant, carrying professional calm. "I heard you're not coming to town meetings anymore," she said gently. Frank shrugged. "Busy." She glanced toward the excavation, then back at him. "People are worried. They think you're putting yourself at risk." Frank considered her words. unlike Bill Sarah's concern, carried no mockery. It carried fatigue, the kind that came from seeing preventable harm too often. "They can worry," he said. "I'll keep working." Sarah studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "If you need medical supplies," she said, "or if something goes wrong, you know where to find me." "I know," Frank replied. She smiled faintly, then looked down at Max. The dog met her gaze calmly, tail barely moving. "He trusts you," she said. "He should," Frank answered. "I don't lie to him." As winter deepened, the jokes hardened into something sharper. At the supply store, conversations paused when Frank entered. He felt the glances, the quick looks exchanged. He did not mind. He had been misunderstood before, and misunderstanding had never killed him. Cold had. Inside the underground room, the air felt different, now still dry, stable. Frank lit the small iron stove for the first time, feeding it sparingly. He watched the thermometer climb slowly, steadily, not fighting the cold, but easing away from it. He placed his palm against the stone wall and felt warmth begin to collect, patient and restrained. Max descended the ladder cautiously, nails clicking against wood, then circled once before lying down with a sigh that carried both effort and contentment. The dog's breathing slowed. Frank sat on the rough bench beside him, listening. Above them, the wind rose. Frank did not feel triumph. He felt readiness. Whatever the town believed, whatever they said behind his back, he knew this winter would come as it always did, indifferent to opinions. When it did, he would not argue with it. He would simply be where it could not reach him easily. And Max would be there too. The first true cold snap arrived without ceremony, sliding into Duluth on a gray morning when the lake disappeared behind a wall of blowing snow and the air itself seemed to harden. Frank Walker noticed it not by the temperature reading nailed outside his cabin, but by the way sound changed, how footsteps became sharper, how Max's breathing grew slower and deeper, how the wind no longer wandered, but pressed deliberate and testing. Frank did not fear that sound. He recognized it. Inside the underground room, the world felt different. The air was still dry in a way that did not bite. The stone walls, now fully set, held a faint warmth that lingered even hours after the stove had burned down to embers. Frank moved through the space with measured satisfaction, checking joints, feeling for moisture, listening for unwanted drafts. This was not comfort, as other men understood it. This was control. This was margin. The room was modest, but purposeful. Riverstone walls rose to shoulder height before curving slightly inward, their smooth surfaces reflecting a soft, uneven glow from the oil lamp mounted near the ladder. Overhead, timber beams crossed the ceiling in clean, simple lines, supporting packed earth and insulation above. The stove sat against the far wall, its iron darkened by use, its firebox small but efficient. Frank had built it that way intentionally. Large fires wasted fuel and attention. Small fires rewarded patience. Max claimed the corner closest to the stove. Frank had laid a thick pad of wool blankets there, topped with an old military sleeping mat that still carried the faint scent of canvas and oil. The German shepherd circled once before settling, lowering himself carefully, joints stiff but obedient. His muzzle rested on his paws, eyes half-lidded, but alert. The dog understood this place instinctively. It felt like a den, like safety earned rather than granted. Frank sat on the narrow bench opposite him and allowed himself for the first time in years to simply sit without tension. The memory came then, as it always did when the cold deepened. Ellen had loved winter, at least in the beginning. She had laughed at the snow, stood barefoot by the window wrapped in a blanket, insisted that storms were only frightening if you fought them. She was small compared to Frank, slender and soft-spoken, with dark hair that curled at the ends, no matter how often she tried to tame it. Her skin bruised easily, her hands always cold. She believed in warmth as something emotional, not mechanical. When the power went out that winter, Frank had told her they would be fun. He had meant it. He had stacked wood, sealed doors planned for inconvenience. What he had not planned for was duration. Night after night, the temperature dropped. Pipes froze. The fire struggled. Ellen's cough deepened, turned wet, then quiet. By the time Frank realized the cold had already taken hold inside her, it was too late. That lesson stayed with him more sharply than any he had learned under fire. Cold was not dramatic. It did not announce itself as an enemy. It waited. It exploited assumptions. It punished hesitation. Frank rose and adjusted the stove, feeding it just enough to lift the room a few degrees. The thermometer crept upward. 52, 54. He stopped there. More was unnecessary. Above ground, the town prepared in ways it always had. Firewood piles grew taller. Plastic sealed windows. Heaters were tested and retested. Frank watched it all from a distance, not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding that these measures assumed cooperation from infrastructure, from fuel, from time. Winter did not cooperate. Sarah Collins visited again as December wore on. She arrived one late afternoon, her face pinched by cold, her coat dusted white. She had removed her gloves before knocking her hands already reddening. "I heard you've moved your bed," she said when Frank opened the door. He nodded, below. She hesitated, then asked if she could see it. Frank led her inside and down the ladder. Sarah descended carefully, her movements cautious but curious. Up close, the underground room softened her expression. She ran her gloved hand along the stone wall, felt the warmth, frowned slightly in thought. "This is different," she admitted. "It doesn't feel damp." "It won't," Frank said. "Drainage runs downhill, air moves on its own." Sarah stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the space. She had seen hypothermia victims curled into themselves, frostbite blackening fingers and toes. She had seen the way cold erased dignity before it erased life. "This would save people," she said finally. Frank did not answer. Saving people required them to listen. Outside, not everyone shared Sarah's conclusion. Bill Anderson continued to mock what he called Frank's burrow. At the supply store, he told anyone who would listen that the old vet was hiding from life instead of living it. Bill's laughter rang loud, brittle, fueled by a certainty that had never been tested the way Frank's had. Max bristled once when Bill came too close to the cabin, a low warning rumble in his chest. Frank laid a hand on the dog's head, fingers sinking into thick fur, steadying him. "Easy," he murmured. "Not worth it." The first storm hit just before Christmas. Not catastrophic, but instructive. Winds howled through the night, rattling shutters, burying doors. Frank and Max slept below the underground room, holding steady the stove barely fed. Above ground, neighbors rose hourly to tend fires, exhaustion settling in before dawn. In the morning, Frank emerged to a world reshaped. Snowdrifts towered over fences. A few houses sat dark, their chimneys silent. He checked on livestock where he could move without hurry, his breath calm. Max followed tail, low alert. At Bill Anderson's place, smoke curled weakly from the chimney. Bill stood outside, face pale beneath his beard, eyes rimmed red with fatigue. "Didn't sleep much," Bill muttered when Frank stopped nearby. Fire kept dying. Frank nodded once. He did not offer advice, not yet. Later that night back underground, Frank lay awake longer than usual. The room was quiet except for Max's breathing and the faint tick of cooling metal. Frank stared at the ceiling, at the beams, holding back the weight of the world, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, responsibility. He knew now beyond doubt that this place worked, that it would keep him alive. And he knew that others would not be so fortunate, not because the solution was complicated, but because it was unfamiliar. Old knowledge dismissed as foolish was being buried along with the people who needed it most. Frank turned on his side, resting a hand against Max's warm flank. "I won't lose another one," he said softly, though whether he meant Ellen himself or the town he could not say. Above them, winter gathered strength. Below, Frank Walker waited. January arrived like a lie before it revealed itself as a verdict. The first morning of the storm dawned deceptively mild. The sky a dull, overcast gray that promised nothing worse than another ordinary winter day in Duluth. Frank Walker noticed the false calm immediately. The air felt wrong too, still too heavy, as if the cold were gathering itself rather than dispersing. Max sensed it too. The old German shepherd refused to wander far from the cabin, pacing in slow, tight circles, ears twitching at sounds too distant for human hearing. By noon, the wind began to rise. It did not arrive gradually. It exploded. Gusts slammed into the trees with a force that made trunks creak and branches snap like dry bones. Snow followed, driven sideways, not falling so much as attacking. Within an hour, visibility collapsed. The road disappeared first, then the fence lines, then even the nearest neighboring cabins dissolved into white nothingness. The temperature plunged with terrifying speed, dropping more than 30 degrees in the span of a few hours. Power lines failed one by one, the grid surrendering to ice and wind. Frank did not hesitate. He had been waiting for this. He led Max down into the underground room as the first transformer blew somewhere in town, the distant crack muffled by the growing roar outside. Frank sealed the hatch above them, securing the insulated cover into place. The small iron stove was already prepared, kindling stacked airflow checked. He lit it with deliberate calm, feeding it just enough to maintain warmth, not enough to waste precious fuel. The thermometer hovered steadily near 60. The stone walls absorbed the heat silently, faithfully. Above ground, the town descended into chaos. Inside his cabin, furniture rattled. Wind clawed at the walls. Snow piled against the door with relentless force. Frank heard it all only faintly, as if the storm belonged to another world. Underground, the air remained still. Max settled into his bedding with a long exhale, curling his aging body carefully. His breathing slowed, deep and even. Trust radiated from him without question. Frank sat on the bench, hands resting on his knees, listening not to the storm but to memory. He thought of nights overseas when artillery thundered above bunkers, when survival meant trusting dirt and concrete more than steel and courage. He thought of Ellen, of the way her breath had sounded near the end, shallow, and strained how helpless he had felt as the cold seeped into her lungs. This time, helplessness did not accompany the noise. Preparedness did. The storm raged through the night. In town, desperation unfolded house by house. Fireplaces roared as families burned through wood reserves meant to last weeks. Heaters failed. Pipes burst, flooding floors that immediately froze. People ventured outside against better judgment, trying to reach neighbors, barns, shelters. Many never made it. Wind erased landmarks, turned familiar yards into lethal mazes. The cold did not scream, it waited. At Sarah Collins's small rental house near the clinic, she huddled with 2 elderly patients she had refused to send home earlier that day. Sarah was tall and wiry, but exhaustion bent her posture. Now shoulders tight, jaw clenched, as she rationed blankets and checked pulses with numb fingers. Her ash-blonde hair escaped its braid, clinging damply to her temples. She listened to the wind batter the siding and wondered who else was trapped, who else was losing heat minute by minute. At Bill Anderson's place, panic replaced mockery. His fire sputtered as the wind reversed the chimney draft. Smoke filled the room, eyes burned, lungs ached. Bill cursed aloud, pacing, stamping his boots against the floor, as if movement alone could keep the cold from claiming him. He thought bitterly of Frank Walker and his hole. The thought angered him even as it terrified him. Before dawn, the storm reached its peak. Wind speeds climbed to levels that made standing impossible. Snowdrifts buried entire vehicles. The cold reached depths where exposed skin froze in minutes. Somewhere nearby, a roof collapsed under the weight of ice and snow. The sound was swallowed instantly by the storm. Frank slept, not deeply, but peacefully. Underground, the temperature remained nearly constant. The stove consumed only a fraction of the fuel his neighbors burned desperately above. Max shifted once, pressing closer to Frank's boots, seeking warmth and reassurance. Frank rested a hand against the dog's shoulder, felt the steady rise and fall of life beneath his palm. When morning finally came, it arrived without light. Frank woke to silence, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, unnatural quiet that follows devastation. He waited, listening. The wind had eased. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a landscape erased. He climbed the ladder carefully and pushed against the hatch. It did not move. Snow had sealed it shut. Frank retrieved his shovel from its place beside the ladder and began digging upward, working methodically, conserving breath, conserving strength. After nearly an hour, light spilled in. He forced the hatch open and emerged into a world transformed. The cabin door was buried beneath a wall of snow taller than he was. Trees leaned at broken angles. Power lines lay coiled and dead across the ground. The air burned his lungs with cold so sharp it felt chemical. Max climbed out behind him, blinking against the brightness, then stood perfectly still, ears forward, sensing danger everywhere. Frank moved through the ruins. He checked the nearest houses first. At the Henderson place, the door was frozen shut. Inside, the family had burned furniture to stay alive. It had not been enough. Frank did not linger. He closed what doors he could, marked what he must. His face remained composed, but something behind his eyes hardened like ice forming beneath still water. At Bill Anderson's cabin, Frank found the man slumped near the hearth hands, blackened by frostbite, eyes open and unseeing. The fire had died hours before the storm loosened its grip. Frank stood there for a long moment, the wind tugging at his jacket. Grief and anger tangling inside him. Bill had laughed at preparation. Winter had not laughed back. By mid-afternoon, survivors began to emerge, stumbling from homes, from barns, from makeshift shelters. Faces were pale eyes, hollow. They looked at Frank Walker in disbelief as he moved among them with steady steps, color still in his cheeks, hands unshaking. How someone whispered. Frank did not answer yet. That night he returned underground with Max. The dog trembled faintly, not from cold, but from what he had sensed all day, death lingering in the air. Frank fed the stove, sat on the bench, and stared at the stone wall. He had prepared for winter. He had not prepared for this. The days after the blizzard passed did not return Duluth to life. They revealed how close it had come to losing it entirely. The snow lay in uneven walls hardened by wind, scarred by footprints that led nowhere. Smoke no longer rose from several chimneys. Doors stood frozen shut. The town moved slowly, quietly, as if sound itself might wake something cruel that had merely gone dormant. Frank Walker did not wait to be asked. On the second morning after the storm, he walked into town with Max at his side, the red and black buffalo-plaid flannel stark against the white emptiness. His boots broke the crusted snow with steady rhythm. Max followed close, his head low ears, alert, his breath visible in short clouds. People noticed them immediately. They always had, but never like this. Frank looked unchanged, his beard still neat, his posture steady, his hands uninjured by frost. That alone unsettled people. They gathered near the supply store, near the clinic, near any place still standing, with walls intact. Faces were thinner now, eyes rimmed red from cold and grief. No one laughed. No one made jokes. The first to speak was Thomas Reed, a man in his early 40s with a narrow face and deep-set eyes that had aged a decade overnight. Thomas had once worked construction before a back injury ended his career. He stood slightly hunched now, wrapped in a borrowed coat, his hands trembling not from cold, but from exhaustion. "How did you live?" Thomas asked, his voice rough. "Your house is smaller than mine. Your stove, it's nothing special." Others leaned in. Frank felt their attention like pressure against his chest. He did not answer immediately. He looked at Max instead. The dog sat calmly beside him, tail wrapped around his paws, eyes moving from face to face. Max did not see accusation or shame. He saw uncertainty, fear, and something close to hope. "I didn't fight the cold," Frank said finally. His voice was quiet even. "I stepped out of its way." Sarah Collins stood near the back of the crowd. She looked different now, drawn, hollowed by long hours without rest. Her ash-blonde hair had slipped loose from its braid, falling around her face in pale strands. Her skin was gray with fatigue, her eyes sharper than ever. She had lost 2 patients during the storm. She carried that weight visibly in the way her shoulders never quite relaxed. "You went underground," she said. Frank nodded. "Below the frost line, where the ground stays the same temperature year-round." A murmur moved through the group. He explained then, not emotionally, not defensively, but carefully. He spoke of depth of drainage of stone and thermal mass. He described how Earth absorbed heat and returned it slowly, how starting from 52 degrees instead of below zero meant survival required far less fire, far less risk. He described airflow, moisture control, insulation. He spoke as a man teaching something practical, not selling an idea. No one interrupted him. When he finished, silence returned. It was a different silence than before. Not dismissal. Recognition. Someone asked to see it. Frank hesitated only a moment, then nodded. They came in small groups at first. Down the ladder into the underground room that had been mocked as a grave. Men and women descended cautiously, brushing snow from their boots, eyes adjusting to the soft lamplight. They touched the stone walls. They felt the warmth. They inhaled air that did not sting. Sarah stood near the ladder, her gloved hand pressed flat against the stone. "This would have saved them," she said quietly, not accusing, not pleading, just stating truth. Frank said nothing. Others followed. Some wept openly. Some turned away ashamed. No one laughed. Over the following weeks, the town changed. Frank did not become the leader in the way men usually did. He did not give speeches or organize committees. He simply worked, and those who wished to learn came to him. They came early in the mornings and late in the afternoons. Men with frost-bitten fingers, women with hollow eyes, teenagers suddenly older than their years. Frank showed them where to dig, how deep, how to angle drainage trenches so water would never pool. He explained why smooth river stones were better than fractured rock, why ventilation mattered more than warmth, why shortcuts killed. Max was always there. The old German shepherd lay near the excavation sites, sometimes dozing, sometimes watching. His presence seemed to calm people. Children who had lost siblings sat near him, fingers buried in his thick fur. Max accepted the touch without moving away, his amber eyes steady, his body warm. He had seen fear before. He understood quiet suffering. One afternoon, a woman named Margaret Lewis arrived with her son. Margaret was in her mid-30s, her face thin, her dark hair pulled back tightly, as if holding herself together required constant effort. Her son Eli was 9 years old, small for his age, with wide eyes that darted constantly. His father had died in the storm, caught between the barn and the house. Margaret listened as Frank explained how deep to dig. She nodded, absorbing every word. "Will it really work?" she asked. Frank looked at Eli at the way the boy leaned unconsciously toward Max, seeking warmth. "It will," he said, "if you build it right." By the time February loosened its grip, 7 families had begun underground rooms of their own. The work was brutal. The ground resisted, muscles burned, but no one complained. Pain was temporary, memory was not. Sarah began documenting everything. She wrote at night by lamplight, her handwriting precise despite exhaustion. She recorded measurements, materials, mistakes, corrections. She understood now that survival knowledge meant nothing if it died with the person who held it. She showed Frank the pages one evening. "I want to send this to other towns," she said. "If we had known." Frank closed the notebook gently. "Send it," he said. Spring came slowly, reluctantly. Snow melted into mud. The lake breathed again. Duluth bore its scars, openly empty houses, missing names, quiet streets. Frank did not rebuild his life in any grand way. He did not profit. He did not leave. He kept teaching until no one needed teaching anymore. When winter returned the following year, it did not take the town by surprise. Underground rooms held warmth. Fires burned low and steady. No one froze to death. Frank watched from his cabin, Max beside him, the storm pressing uselessly against the earth above them. Silence had finally learned how to apologize. At the end of this story, what remains is not just survival, but meaning. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive as fire from the sky or voices from heaven. Sometimes they arrive quietly through memory, through wisdom passed down through a man who listened when others laughed. God did not stop the winter, but he placed knowledge in human hands. And those who respected that knowledge were spared. In our daily lives, we often ignore the small warnings, the quiet preparations, the lessons that seem old or unnecessary. We wait for miracles, forgetting that preparation itself can be a blessing. This story reminds us that faith is not only about praying for protection, but about acting with humility, foresight, and care for one another. The ground that sheltered Frank was not just earth, it was grace given long before the storm arrived. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on what you may be overlooking in your own life. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us what lesson you took from it. And if you believe stories like this matter, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing them. May God watch over you and your loved ones. May He grant you wisdom before danger, warmth in times of cold, and peace in every season of your life.